tell everyone where he was at up to 1864.
Thank you, General. I really appreciate each of you being here this evening. Before I go any further, I'd like to point out something that I heretofore had not seen of General Grant. He expressed his appreciation for you being here. You know, Yankees don't normally say thank you, they just kind of bluntly. So his presence here in the South, and particularly in Arkansas, has obviously done something to his character, and I think that we can be impressed by that.
General, traveling around the world has increased my politeness and my manners, maybe.
Particularly when you came to Arkansas.
Yes.
Many of you know that in April of 1861, I was offered command of the United States Army. It was to be the largest army in the world. It was up until then, the Army of the United States Army consisted of about 16,000 officers and enlistees. And President Lincoln had called for 75,000 volunteers, which would have then made it an army in excess of 90,000. And on April the 18th, I met with Francis Blair. And he offered, on behalf of the Lincoln administration, he offered me command of that army. And I explained to them that the Virginia legislature was in session and that it depended on what they did as to what my reactions would be, because if Virginia did indeed secede from the Union, I would have no other recourse but to resign my commission in the United States Army and accept in my defense of my native Virginia, I would not pick up my saber again. And I returned to Arlington, and within an hour a courier came in from Richmond indicating in a message that Virginia had seceded. After 32 years of service, that's a difficult decision to make. But as I mentioned to some folks last night, I provided them some ideas as to the thought process. But as we were taught by the United States government at the United States Military Academy, the Constitution says preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. It does not say preserve, protect, and defend the Union. It says preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And I took an oath, and I made a promise. An oath is a promise. What's a promise mean to you?
A promise? Well, to do what you said.
How old are you?
You would do?
How old are you? 10. Here's a 10-year-old man, young man, who says that when you make a promise, it's something that you keep. And so when I made a promise to the Constitution of the United States, I kept it. My country was Virginia, and as long as Virginia was a member of the Union, then my loyalty transferred from Virginia to the Union. But once Virginia exercised its constitutional right of secession and withdrew from the Union, then I had no other option but to resign my commission and join with Virginia in its defense. A lot of controversy, but I immediately, within a few days, I was summoned to Richmond, and I accepted a position as a brigadier in the Virginia militia. I served in that capacity until Virginia, after having withdrawn from the Union of American Countries. At that point, Virginia then aligned themselves with the Confederate States of America. And I then became a brigadier in the Confederate Army, served as the senior advisor, military advisor to President Davis for the first year, until on May the 30th of 1862, General Joe Johnston was wounded, and I assumed command of the Army of Northern Virginia on June the 1st of 1862. Shortly after that, we were successful in pressing the Union forces until they withdrew from the Virginia Peninsula. McClellan was in charge of them at that time. They withdrew, and at that point we began to mobilize our forces with what we had and began moving in a northward direction, because we knew that General Pope was amassing his forces up in the area of Manassas Junction, and so we moved our forces toward Manassas Junction. At the same time that was happening, the forces from General McClellan were also going up the Potomac, and they were joining up with General Pope, and so he had a massive army. We engaged them at Manassas Junction in late August of 1862, and as we had done in July of 1861, a year earlier, the Union forces retreated back to Washington City. And at that point, we felt it was in our best position to move into the north. We moved across the river and into Maryland. Our goal was to, for those of you that weren't aware, Mr. Lincoln's government had arrested most of the Maryland legislature and put them in jail because they were thinking about meeting to discuss the possibility of secession. And Mr. Lincoln didn't want them to even think about meeting to do that. So he had arrested most of the Maryland legislature, so we felt, and declared martial law. So we felt that if we went into Maryland, that we could let them make their own decision as to whether they wanted to go with the Union side or whether they wanted to go with the Confederate side. The result was the Battle of Sharpsburg. Some of you may know it as the Battle of Antietam, but we call it the Battle of Sharpsburg. And that was in September of 1862, and then 2 or 3 months after that, we engaged the Union Army in the area of Fredericksburg, Virginia, and that was in December, I think the date was December 13th of 1862. General Burnside had been promoted to the to command the Army of the Potomac at that time, and we were successful in pressing their folks back. The Battle of Mary's Heights, you've probably heard about that. A significant victory for us, although shortly after that, General Burnside was again on the move in what they referred to as the Mud March, which didn't really accomplish much. He was replaced by General Hooker, and a few months after that, we met with General Hooker on the areas surrounding Chancellorsville Crossing in Virginia. And through the magnificent actions of General Jackson, who wrapped up their right flank, we were able to press the Union forces again in a rather rapid fashion. They moved backwards toward Washington City. The loss there of General Jackson was tremendous. In fact, I penned a message to General Jackson that I urged him to play well, for while he had lost his left arm, I had lost my right. We reorganized the Army. Instead of having 2 corps, we reorganized it to 3 corps. General Longstreet was still in command of the 1st Corps. I put General Richard Ewell in charge of the 2nd Corps, and Paul Hill was in charge of the 3rd Corps, and we made an advance into Gettysburg. A number of reasons, and I suspect before we get through here this evening, we'll probably chat about the reasons that we decided to go to Gettysburg, and probably some other things about Gettysburg, since that seems to be a question that most people seem to ask. So I won't get into that right now. But we met those people on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863 in the Gettysburg area, and after several hotly contested engagements, we withdrew from Gettysburg back across the Potomac. I should point out that while we were not successful in our military adventure in an effort to dissolve the Union Army, we were able to garner enough supplies in that foray to last our army well into the spring of 1864. To give you an idea as to how many wagons we had, when the lead element of our wagons left Chambersburg and headed back down, by the time it reached Winchester, Virginia, the last wagon was just leaving Chambersburg, and that's about 50 miles difference. So there was 50 miles worth of wagons that were supplies that we had gathered into Pennsylvania while we were there in the northern part of Virginia. And those, as I mentioned, those supplies lasted us on through, basically through the winter. In the spring of 1864, I received word through my sources that the Union Army was now under the command of a man that I had met briefly in Mexico, that General Grant, who had been successful in Vicksburg in July of 1863, that General Grant was now in charge of the Union Army. And I recognized immediately that I had a different type of opponent than anything that I had engaged with in the past. So I think at that point we're both up to the point where we began to engage each other on the battlefield. And I'll step out of the picture, and if you want to go ahead and begin with some questions, we'll be happy.
Well, General Lee, don't step out too far from the picture, because I think I'll begin my questions with you. Seldom, if ever, General, has there been a more celebrated leader of a defeated army, of a lost cause. Your men, your people worship you. You have attained a much beloved position in history. Many of us grew up thinking really of you as the beau ideal, the man, every man wants.